My guest at this time is Hans von Spakovsky. He is the manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington. He's also a former Justice Department official, and he was a member of President Trump's Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. We want to get his thoughts on a couple of things today, beginning with the controversy over the congressional results in North Carolina's 9th District, where it appeared that the Republican had narrowly won, but now there are significant allegations of election fraud committed by a group connected to the Republican nominee. There's also some allegations against the Democratic side, too. But we also want to get Hans's thoughts a little bit later on President Trump's choice of Bill Barr as his next attorney general. And Hans, it's always good to have you with us. Thanks for your time.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Well, this was essentially an open seat. Congressman Robert Pittenger had lost the Republican primary to Pastor Mark Harris, who is running against a former Marine named Dan McCready by a little over 900 votes. Mark Harris was declared the winner, but now we have these allegations that a group contracted with the Harris campaign had gone around collecting absentee ballots, essentially, that had been mailed to folks in predominantly minority neighborhoods. As a result, we've got this announcement now from McCready, who is withdrawing his concession.
Hey, folks, I'm Dan McCready. A month ago, I conceded to my opponent, Mark Harris, in the race for North Carolina's 9th Congressional District. But last week, we began to learn about shameful criminal activity bankrolled by my opponent to take away North Carolinians' very rights to vote. I didn't serve overseas in the Marine Corps just to come back home and watch politicians and career criminals attack our democracy. That's why today, I withdraw my concession to Mark Harris, who's remained completely silent. And I call on Mark Harris to tell us exactly what he knew and when he knew it. Join me in this fight for the people whose voices were taken from them.
So, Hans, there are also reports now that groups affiliated with the Democrats were collecting absentee ballots as well. They say they were filled out and they were just transporting them to the place where they needed to go, which is also a violation of the law. But they say it's a lot different because those votes had at least been cast. What's your read on all of this? Where does this really stand right now?
Well, where it stands is that this is something that election officials and potentially law enforcement, they need to investigate it. I mean, what's happening in North Carolina is called vote harvesting. And for folks who've never heard that term, what it means is that, look, in every state you can vote by absentee ballot if you can't make it to the polls. But in many states, including in North Carolina, you can either mail that completed ballot back to election officials, or you or a member of your family can hand deliver it back to election officials. North Carolina, like many other states, bars other individuals, other third parties, from collecting that ballot from you and delivering it to election officials. And there's a very good reason for that. You don't want to put these completed absentee ballots in the hands of party operatives, activists working for candidates. Why? Because they may change your ballot. They may toss out your ballot if, for example, they figure out that you are a member of the opposite political party and won't be voting for their candidate. And there's just too much incentive there for these party operatives and activists working for candidates to interfere with your ballot. And that's why it is outlawed. Now, clearly, it sounds like both sides were violating the law on vote harvesting. The issue is, were any of those ballots changed? Were any of them filled out by candidate activists and operatives? All of which would be also illegal, and it's the changing of the ballot that might affect the outcome of the election.
Well, the argument from the Democrats is that the Republican contracted operatives swiped the ballots before they were ever filled out. I believe that's the allegation. So how do we go from there?
This is a painstaking process. They have to call voters who submitted absentee ballots and interview them and ask them whether they had completed the ballot before it was sent. That's the kind of case-by-case investigation that has to be done. We should point out that while there is a great deal of attention being paid to this by very liberal media organs like the Washington Post and the New York Times, they, in essence, ignored vote harvesting going on in other states that seem to benefit the Democrats. California made vote harvesting legal in a relatively recent statute, and many congressional races out there were changed by absentee ballots brought in by party operatives after Election Day. And another example of this, Greg, is that about a month before the election, 4 women in Tarrant County, Texas, were criminally charged and arrested for vote harvesting there, particularly getting the ballots of elderly voters, forging signatures, changing the ballots, filling them out, and this was being apparently financed by the former executive director of the local Democratic Party.
Let's go back to California, because I remember reading about that in recent days, and one of the provisions of that law is, unlike the North Carolina law, anybody can turn those back in, correct?
That is exactly right. They have legalized vote harvesting. So there is no telling, without doing a major investigation, how many of the ballots that were picked up by third parties, how many of them actually made it to election officials, how many of them were not changed once they got into the hands of these third parties. We're not going to know that unless an investigation is done, and it's very clear no such investigation is going to be conducted, because California election officials have said they're proud of this new law, the same law Democrats are complaining about, the same kind of process, vote harvesting, that Democrats are now complaining about in North Carolina.
Let's go back to the North Carolina race for a moment. There's a lot of folks now, including the Republican Party of North Carolina, calling for a new election there. The problem is that the law doesn't actually have a provision for that. So how will this ultimately be decided? Will the governor call for a new election anyway? Will this lengthy investigation that you referred to a moment ago just have to play itself out? What's likely to be the result here?
They should not have a new election until and unless an investigation shows that enough ballots were somehow changed or manipulated that equal the margin of victory in the race, or so many issues of potential fraud have been raised that it throws into serious doubt the outcome of the election. Only evidence indicating one of those two would be sufficient to order a new election.
Okay, so we know that both sides are at least accused of violating the law in various ways in this particular House race. We talked about what's happening in California. We talked about what's already been caught or at least alleged in Texas. And so if it's happening on both sides of one congressional race out of 435 and may have been involved in a handful of races at least out there in California, chances are that it's happening in other places we don't know about. So what does this tell us about absentee balloting in general, how vulnerable it is to mischief, and what type of restraints would be smart to apply here? In other words, should it only be held at government facilities a few days ahead, kind of like early voting, and you really have to have a good reason to not show up on Election Day? Or do we just have to figure out ways to accommodate the absentee ballot popularity as it is?
I think there are a series of steps that need to be taken. One, we really should minimize absentee balloting. States that have passed laws saying anyone can vote an absentee ballot, no excuse necessary, really need to put in requiring an excuse. You know, if you're physically disabled, you're ill, and you can't make it to the polls, that's fine. Vote an absentee ballot. They need to ban vote harvesting, put in severe penalties for individuals who break that law, and frankly, another way of trying to deter, for example, absentee ballots being forged is to require voter ID with absentee ballots the same way you require voter ID with in-person ballots. A number of states have done that. Kansas is one. Alabama is another.
What about notaries? Is that going too far? It does cost money, and so that could get a little complicated. But is that a way to make sure it's being done on the up and up?
Well, another way of doing that is to also require that the signature of the voter on the ballot is either notarized or has the signatures, names, and contact information of two witnesses who can be contacted by investigators if necessary to ensure that the ballot was properly voted. In fact, I think North Carolina has such a requirement, and that is, in fact, one of the ways they determined there was a possible problem, because I believe they noticed that the same person was witnessing a very large number of ballots, which shows that there's a possible problem.
Nobody said criminals were smart, at least not all the time. So, Hans, one of my favorite explanations to come out of this story is that this is election fraud. It's not voter fraud because voter fraud isn't real, but this is election fraud and it is real. You obviously have a very different view on this. First of all, is there a difference between what you and I have been talking about many times in the past and what we're seeing allegedly in North Carolina? And what do you make of efforts to distinguish the two?
I think they are trying to cause confusion, whether it's called election fraud or voter fraud. It's fraud on the outcome of an election, and sometimes it's committed by voters, sometimes it's committed by election officials, and sometimes it's committed by people working for campaigns. It doesn't matter which of those two titles you use. It's fraud that can affect the fair casting and counting of ballots, and it's something we should all be concerned of, frankly, no matter what political party we're with.
All right. I said at the outset we wanted to get your thoughts on the president's choice of a new attorney general. A couple minutes to do that here. The name is Bill Barr. He was actually attorney general in the last couple of years of the George H.W. Bush administration. He is someone who is generally thought of pretty highly, but I don't think it's a name that a lot of people are familiar with if you're not in D.C. legal circles. So what do you think of the president's choice, and what kind of attorney general do you think Bill Barr would be?
I think it's actually a good choice. If you talk to lawyers in Washington, they'll tell you that he's widely respected. He's very experienced. He's highly qualified. Probably most important is that he has 5 years of prior experience inside the Justice Department. That includes 2 years as the 77th Attorney General of the United States. Before that, for 2 years, he held the job of Deputy Attorney General. That's the number 2 slot. That's the one currently held by Rod Rosenstein. And before that, he held another position as an Assistant Attorney General. The reason that's important is that experience means that he knows the Justice Department. He's not going to have a long learning curve like someone would who doesn't have prior experience at the Justice Department. And I don't think the president wants somebody who's not going to be able to start acting immediately on his law enforcement priorities. And Barr clearly will be able to do that.
Last question. How much has the Justice Department changed in the last 25 years?
It has changed a great deal, particularly during the Obama administration when Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch were the attorney generals. They politicized the department to an extent that I don't think we had ever seen before. And Jeff Sessions actually spent the last 2 years trying to clean some of that up and bring the department back into administering justice in a fair and impartial manner. And that job is far from completed, and I think it's something that Barr is going to have to also work on.
That's Hans' short answer. If you want his long answer, pick up a copy of Obama's Enforcer. He wrote an entire book on this subject, so it's worth reading if you want to know more about how the Justice Department changed during the Obama years. And Hans, great discussion all the way around. Thanks for your time today, as always.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Hans von Spakovsky is the manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation. He's a former Justice Department official and was a member of President Trump's Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.